When Joe Mazzulla looks at his roster, he sees something most Eastern Conference teams would envy. Yet there's one uncomfortable truth that keeps him awake at night. While Jaylen Brown continues his relentless assault on defenses and the team sits atop the conference despite missing its superstar, there exists a critical vulnerability that could derail Boston's championship aspirations when the playoffs arrive. The answer to this problem isn't a marquee name that would make headlines across ESPN, but rather a 24-year-old from the Brooklyn Nets whose quiet effectiveness has been flying under the radar of casual basketball fans. Day'Ron Sharpe represents something increasingly rare in modern basketball, a player whose value lies not in highlight reels or social media moments, but in the unglamorous battle for possession of the ball when it matters most. The rebounding mathematics behind playoff basketball reveals a startling reality that most casual fans overlook. Teams that control the glass in May and June win championships far more often than those blessed with perimeter brilliance. Sharpe's contract situation at approximately $2 million annually makes him perhaps the most fiscally intelligent acquisition target available in the current market, a player capable of transforming Boston's interior presence without mortgaging the team's salary cap flexibility for years to come. What makes this scenario particularly intriguing is the limitation behind Tatum and Garza, two capable but ultimately supporting players who cannot shoulder the weight of a deep playoff run when opposing teams deploy their most physical centers. Sharpe's explosiveness off the floor, combined with his willingness to engage in the physical confrontations that define playoff basketball, addresses a dimension of the game that numbers alone cannot capture. The former North Carolina standout brings a physicality that transforms defensive rebounds into possessions and second-chance opportunities into momentum shifters. Exactly what Boston needs when facing the Eastern Conference's most athletic frontcourts. Brooklyn's perspective on this trade scenario reveals the pragmatic rebuilding philosophy that increasingly defines NBA strategy in the modern era. The Nets organization recognizes that while Sharpe has performed admirably as a backup center this season, he represents exactly the type of complementary piece that shouldn't consume organizational resources during a fundamental restructuring period. Accumulating future draft capital becomes paramount when building a franchise from the ground up, and converting a secondary player with an expiring contract into additional selection opportunities represents shrewd asset management by any measure. What if everything you thought you knew about the 2024-25 Boston Celtics was incomplete? A carefully constructed narrative hiding a more aggressive truth lurking beneath the surface. Brad Stevens has spent months publicly preaching restraint and patience while Jayson Tatum recovered. Yet, behind closed doors in league circles, a completely different conversation has been occurring, one that suggests Boston's front office has been plotting a transformation that could fundamentally reshape Eastern Conference dynamics. The subtle shift in tone from league insiders indicates that the Celtics' strategy has evolved from a wait-and-see approach into something far more provocative. Something that signals the organization believes it possesses the assets and flexibility to pursue legitimate upgrades during the final weeks before the trade deadline. Ivica Zubac represents something beyond typical center statistics. His presence addresses the specific deficiency that defensive analytics consistently expose about Boston's current frontcourt when facing athletic and physical teams during playoff basketball. The 7-footer's ability to simultaneously protect the rim at elite levels while maintaining unexpected versatility in screen and roll actions creates spacing problems for opponents that Tatum and Garza simply cannot generate. His rebounding prowess at 10.8 boards per game emerges as particularly crucial when analyzed against expected playoff possession patterns, where every rebound becomes magnified in importance. The Anfernee-Simons component of this potential exchange introduces a layer of sophistication that extends beyond surface-level shooting percentages. Simons' expiring contract status transforms him into a unique asset for Boston, a player whose production at 9 points per game, shooting 40% from 3, provides exactly the kind of scoring punch that maintains offensive flexibility. when the team potentially needs to inject bench unit scoring without relying on Tatum and Brown. His integration into Boston's system wouldn't require a fundamental restructuring of offensive principles. Rather, it would represent an enhancement of existing positional depth that multiplies the team's closing lineup options. The rumor mill consistently reveals that Los Angeles is simultaneously pursuing Simons, creating legitimate competition for his acquisition rights. Yet Boston's existing connections to Zubac provide an asymmetric advantage in constructing a direct swap. This positioning suggests that league insiders already understand the contours of what Boston is orchestrating, that the trade deadline isn't approaching as an obstacle, but as an opportunity for a franchise confident enough in its foundational pieces to enhance them rather than remain static. For supporters who watched this team maintain excellence without Tatum, while Jaylen Brown elevated his game beyond previous expectations, the prospect of adding legitimate frontcourt support alongside the eventual return of your franchise cornerstone doesn't represent desperation. It represents the moment when a championship contender transforms into something considerably more dangerous. The Sam Hauser paradox that could reshape Boston's championship timeline. Here lies the uncomfortable truth that most basketball analysts have completely overlooked. A scenario where a player's excellence becomes the primary argument for his own removal from a roster designed to compete for a championship. Sam Hauser's unexpected resurgence represents something far more complex than typical narrative arcs suggest. An asset that simultaneously strengthens Boston's immediate competitive window while creating the exact leverage needed to acquire the missing piece that could elevate the Celtics from contenders to inevitable champions. The 28-year-old has engineered a professional comeback that few predicted possible after his benching seemed to signal organizational dissatisfaction. Yet his January performance, shooting 48.2% from three while averaging 14.5 points per game, has introduced a completely different calculus into Brad Stevens' trade deadline planning. The psychological dimension of what Hauser's current excellence reveals cannot be overstated in franchise decision-making, particularly when examined against the backdrop of Boston's salary cap constraints and the urgent need for front-court reinforcement. His cost-controlled contract at $44 million across 4 years provides exactly the type of tradable asset that teams seeking cap relief and proven wing production desperately pursue. Yet simultaneously, his two-way contribution at both ends of the floor has become genuinely irreplaceable in ways that traditional statistics cannot quantify. The spacing advantage created when Hauser is on the floor generates offensive freedom for Tatum and Brown that fundamentally changes opponent defensive schemes, a dynamic worth millions in cap flexibility, but also worth questioning whether his departure weakens chemistry that took months to develop. What separates Hauser's situation from typical mid-season trade deadline scenarios is the explicit acknowledgement from Joe Mazzulla that Boston's defensive execution has measurably improved since his reinsertion into the starting lineup, a detail that reveals organizational confidence in roster construction decisions that extend beyond shooting percentages. The 6-3 record since January 3rd represents not statistical variance, but rather systematic improvement in possession defense and transition management, areas where wings of Hauser's caliber provide disproportionate impact that advanced metrics still struggle to capture adequately. Jaylen Brown's public endorsement of Hauser's shooting consistency suggests locker room recognition that his presence enables offensive patterns that make everyone around him more effective, a multiplier effect that complicates simple asset valuation. The intriguing complexity that Brad Stevens now faces exists in the recognition that moving Hauser could paradoxically weaken Boston's playoff chances despite acquiring additional front-court depth. A counterintuitive reality that separates championship organizations from those merely seeking to add names to rosters. The organizational stockpile of young wing depth, including Hugo Gonzalez, Jordan Walsh, and Baylor Shireman, theoretically allows Boston to absorb Hauser's departure. Yet playoff experience remains a commodity those young players cannot replicate, regardless of coaching quality or development trajectory. The Anfernee Simons trap that could derail Boston's entire strategic vision. What if the most obvious trade deadline move available to Brad Stevens actually represents a catastrophic organizational mistake disguised as sensible asset management? A transaction that would solve one problem while creating multiple crises in areas that casual observers have completely overlooked. Anfernee Simon's expiring contract status and his availability on the trade market have created a false narrative suggesting the Celtics should eagerly package him for frontcourt help. Yet his recent production surge off the bench reveals a dimension of value that extends far beyond what contract flexibility suggests on surface examination. The score-first guard has evolved into something considerably more valuable than an asset to be disposed of during deadline season. A reality that complicates every hypothetical trade scenario involving his potential departure and forces Stevens to confront uncomfortable questions about what Boston truly needs versus what the market is offering. The Los Angeles Clippers' reported interest in Simons alongside Colin Sexton and Kobe White creates the illusion of competition for his services. Yet this manufactured urgency obscures a critical organizational reality that most trade deadline analysis completely ignores. Simons' scoring punch off the bench represents irreplaceable production during periods when Tatum and Brown require rest management in the regular season, a statistical reality that becomes exponentially more valuable when analyzed against the specific shortcomings of existing bench unit personnel. The 8 to 12-minute stretches where second-unit guards must generate offensive creation and scoring without primary playmakers have historically plagued Boston's depth structure, creating dead ball possessions and defensive vulnerabilities that modern analytics quantify as costing teams championship opportunities when playoff intensity eliminates margin for error. Chris Forsberg's advocacy for Ivica Zubac reflects conventional wisdom about matching roster construction to defensive rebounding percentiles and paint defense metrics, yet it simultaneously ignores the structural problem that trading Simons to acquire Zubac would create across multiple roster dimensions simultaneously. The Celtics would simultaneously address their frontcourt rebounding deficiency while catastrophically weakening their bench guard rotation. A mathematical trade-off that appears balanced on spreadsheets, but collapses under the pressure of playoff rotations where guard availability becomes non-negotiable. The theoretical solution of acquiring Ayo Dosunmu from Chicago alongside these moves transforms what appeared as singular transaction into a three-team orchestration of remarkable complexity, one that requires coordination across multiple franchise objectives and introduces exponential risk multipliers into execution. The hidden strategic advantage embedded in retaining Simons centers on organizational flexibility that extends beyond the current season, the reality that his unrestricted free agency status this summer creates negotiating leverage that disappears the moment he's traded elsewhere. Stevens could potentially retain Simons on a long-term deal below market value during off-season negotiations if current production trends continue, transforming an expiring contract into organizational control that provides continuity in the exact backcourt depth areas that doom most championship pursuits. The apparent simplicity of Zubac acquisition masks the genuine complexity of substituting proven bench production with an untested newcomer, a risk calculus that rewards organizational patience over deadline panic.